Welcome to the third recorded lecture for History of American Public Policy. Today, we will be talking about developments in immigration policy that took place after the Second World War, particularly around the issue of what to do with refugees seeking to enter the United States from Europe. We will also examine the effect of the civil rights movement on the immigration debate and the series of events that ultimately led to the signing of the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965. Before launching into our discussion of immigration reform in the post-war era, it is important to remember that the quota system put in place in the 1920s was widely accepted by most Americans throughout the 1930s. Although there were certainly efforts to modify or even remove these quotas, little explicit action took place during this period. The Depression limited economic development, and therefore there was not a lot of work to be had for would-be immigrants anyway. Border security was strengthened to the north and south to keep out European and Asian illegals, and the need for a cheap, flexible labor supply in the Southwest was met largely by documented and undocumented Mexican workers who entered through the porous borderland in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. The restrictionists had seemingly won the day by bringing together a coalition of organized labor, conservationists, nativists, and scientists. This situation would change dramatically, though, as World War II was drawing to a close. Although a large coalition existed that sought to keep strict immigration limitations in place and to curb immigration from Mexico, whether to protect the jobs of returning veterans or for more traditional racial reasons, the world was a different place than it was even a few years before. The Nazi regime and the Holocaust had laid bare the logical conclusion of racist and anti-ethnic thinking, and the United States was quickly finding itself in an ideological war with the communist Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of the developing world. Further, a new generation of academics and elites was beginning to question the research of their predecessors, which did so much to provide objective evidence for the need for immigration restriction. As a result, it was increasingly clear, especially to the executive branch, that the United States' draconian immigration restrictions would have to be modified at least. The executive branch was on the front lines of the Cold War in the late 1940s as it sought to limit the sphere of the Soviet Union's influence in Asia and Africa. It also sought to spur on economic development and recovery in Europe and demonstrate to the world that the United States was the true beacon of freedom around the world. One of the first problems that President Truman had to deal with was the issue of displaced persons in Europe, especially Jews, who were living in desperate conditions, oftentimes in the concentration camps that they were formerly imprisoned in throughout Eastern and Central Europe. Many Jewish American leaders demanded that the American government do something about this problem, and President Truman and his staff believed that the hundreds of thousands of displaced persons could not simply be reintegrated into Europe because they would create an economic and social burden on countries trying to recover from the ravages of war. In one of his first acts after the end of the war, Truman issued an executive order allowing for the admission of tens of thousands of European refugees into the country, and he asked Congress to act to ensure that more could be admitted in the coming years. So let's pause now and ask a couple of questions that we'll discuss in class. The first one is, why were tens of thousands of Jews fleeing Nazi Germany denied entry into the United States in the late 30s, but tens of thousands of Jews who had survived the Holocaust were allowed into the United States in December 1945 by President Truman? And the second question is, how did Americans react to Truman's executive order? While Jewish leaders were happy that Truman had agreed to let a few tens of thousands of Jewish displaced persons enter into the country, they knew that this would barely put a dent in the total number of Jewish displaced persons still stuck in European DP camps. They asked Truman to demand that Congress enact legislation to make it possible to bring many more into the country. And Truman himself agreed. He realized that the massive burden of displaced persons would be too much for Europe to deal with at this point. So he asked Congress to act. And one of the things that happened was that Representative William Stratton of Illinois introduced a displaced persons bill that was designed to assist around 400,000 DPs over 4 years. This particular bill was met with strong opposition in Congress, though, and there was very little chance that this bill would pass. Eventually, a compromise bill was reached, and the House of Representatives agreed to allow around 200,000 in, half of what the Stratton bill had initially proposed. Truman was extremely upset about this. He wanted the maximum number possible to be admitted into the country because, remember, he was trying to show the world that the United States was a beacon of freedom and a bulwark against communism. And if we couldn't even allow people who were nearly slaughtered to death to be let into the country, then our arguments for being a global savior would be looked down upon. So, knowing that he needed to get something done, he agreed to sign the eventual act, the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, into law, even though it didn't allow for as many admissions as he would have liked. The bottom line was that restrictionism still ruled the roost in Congress. It's also important to remember that America was finding itself in a very different position than it had been before the Second World War. While the United States had generally been an isolationist nation, by the end of the Second World War, and particularly with the passage of the Marshall Plan in 1948, it had become the linchpin of economic recovery in Europe. This required not only that other countries trust the United States, but also that the American government behave above moral reproach. For Eisenhower, the refugee problem was not simply one of bringing displaced Jews into the country. It was more about the fight against communism that was taking shape in the Cold War. President Eisenhower knew that if he did not have the ability to grant refugee status to people fleeing the horrible conditions that were being produced under communism, then he would not be able to win the public war, to win the war of rhetoric between the United States and the Soviet Union. He had to show that conditions were so bad in places where communism was taking shape that people were coming to the United States to live in a land of freedom and capitalism. As such, he demanded that Congress pass his bill providing for 200,000 or more special visas for European refugees fleeing communism on a non-quota basis. This request was granted in 1953, but it's important to recognize that it set a very high ideological bar. This wasn't for just anyone. There was an extensive background checking process that sought to exclude communists and other undesirables from entering the United States. While the refugee policies of Eisenhower were limited, it's important to recognize how big of a deal this was that Congress actually acted on a request to bring new people into the country, particularly from Central and Eastern Europe. This brings us to the Hungarian refugee crisis, which you should know about from your readings. Rather than discuss this event at length, I'm going to provide you with a set of discussion questions for our conversation next week in the next 2 slides. Please take a few minutes to write them down and to go back through the readings and be able to answer them in class. Here are the first 3 questions. And here are the final 2 questions. This slide brings us to the end of the first part of this lecture. In the second part of the lecture, we will discuss the events leading up to the reopening of immigration to the United States through the so-called front door.